I really do love myself an affordable gaming monitor, and today we're looking at the Philips Evnia 27M2C5501 and the 32M2C5501. Both have the same sort of specifications, other than one has a 27-inch form factor and the other one a 32-inch form factor, the latter actually being on test. Now here you are getting a curved 27 or 32-inch VA panel that operates a resolution of 1440p and a refresh rate that goes up to 180 Hz. They have adaptive sync technology and also HDR capabilities built in. Now at the time of filming and in the UK, the 27-inch model can be found for £190 with an MSRP of £220, while the 32-inch model can be found for just £220 with an MSRP of £260. So yes indeed, they're actually quite affordable given the specifications that you're getting. Now in this video, which has been sponsored by Philips monitors, I'll be covering everything you need to know about them so you can make your own informed purchasing decision. Now to kick things off, I would just like to point out that if you do want to achieve the maximum refresh rate and resolution, you'll have to be connected over DisplayPort. If you opt for connecting over HDMI, you'll be limited to 1440p at 144 Hz. Not a big deal between the two refresh rate ranges, but just something I thought that I should highlight, because if you're getting this monitor and connecting it up, for example, to a laptop, then you'll be capped at a lower refresh rate. Now when it comes to the overall input lag, the monitor has got a low input lag mode that you can enable via the monitor's OSD. You'll certainly want to have this on at any given time because it really does positively affect the overall input lag of the monitor. Now, it's worth highlighting, however, that if you were to enable adaptive sync technology such as AMD FreeSync or NVIDIA G-Sync and actually have them running on, for example, your desktop computer or a console, then we'll grey out the option. This didn't seemingly have a negative impact when it comes to my own subjective testing, but something I thought I should mention. Now when it comes to the overall input lag of the monitor and how it compares with some of its competitors, well, it's still very impressive. It's not the monitor I would pick for hardcore competitive gaming, but equally I wouldn't really look for a curved VA panel for such an instance. Still, while playing a game such as Counter-Strike 2, I had no problems when it came to registering my mouse input. Now another important factor is the response time. Now this is very much linked to the overdrive mode that you select via the monitor's OSD. The higher you go, the faster the response time of the monitor will be, but this can also incur a negative visual experience, which I'll highlight very shortly. Now via the monitor's OSD, you've got off, fast, faster and fastest. The first two modes are somewhat irrelevant because they're going to be the lowest and slowest monitor response times that you'll be able to attain, and here we start testing at the faster mode preset. Now using the OSRTD tool to give me an objective number, you'll be able to see the average initial time. This will be found at the bottom left hand side of your screen. And at 180 Hz, I clocked in 5.34 milliseconds, with the percent in window sitting at roughly 67%. Now as we switched over to the fastest mode preset, you can see that average initial time really drops down to 2.98 milliseconds, making it far more appealing for hardcore gamers, and the percent in window moving up to nearly 87%. However, the caveat is the fact that the RGB overshoot, which you'll be able to say towards the middle of your screen, does have a lot more error. Now what does this mean in practice? Well, quite simply, if you look at the UFO ghosting test, that towards the lighter shades, and for example if you're panning left and right on a game, you'll be able to see some inverse ghosting, which in my opinion was not agreeable to my eyes, and as a result I had to dial it down to the faster mode preset while accepting that the monitor just doesn't run as fast. Now this might be of importance for hardcore gamers, but if you're more of a casual gamer, then it's going to be a non-issue because even the monitor's response time at the faster mode setting is still very good. Now in terms of the overall motion clarity, it is actually quite nice to see that you have got MBR, motion blur reduction, and here you can also tune the overdrive modes no matter what MBR setting you're using, where you've got 20 level increments to choose from. And in this image, which was taken at level 20 MBR, which is the maximum, and on the fast mode preset, you can clearly see that the UFO is a lot clearer. In other words, the motion blur does reduce at the expense of having a locked and limited brightness level. Now when it comes to the overall motion clarity, no issues whatsoever, and given it's a VA panel, the smearing that is actually present, for example if you're going to be scrolling up and down on, let's say, white text on a black background, it was actually kept down to a minimum, which is all very impressive given the fact that VA panels traditionally have quite a bit of smearing, specifically at higher refresh rates. So in this respect, Philips have done a good job in terms of minimizing that and therefore giving you still a good visual experience, be it if you can be gaming or indeed scrolling text. Now, this does actually perfectly bring me on to talking about adaptive sync technologies, because MBR does not run simultaneously with AMD FreeSync or NVIDIA G-Sync. Now here, the VR range sits from 48 up to 180 Hz. Now, while using an RTX 3080 and connected over DisplayPort to the monitor, I was able to run the NVIDIA Pendulum demo, and I didn't encounter any sort of black screen issues or flickering, which meant that NVIDIA G-Sync was indeed correctly running. Furthermore, I was able to run Destiny 2, which is a pretty nice looking game, with 1440p at 180 Hz with NVIDIA G-Sync and also HDR, all simultaneously running in tandem. Now, in terms of the overall HDR reproduction, the monitor only is HDR10 compliant and therefore doesn't even meet the Display HDR 400 certification. As a result, the HDR signal is present and you can utilize it if you so wish, and you've got a few different HDR modes you can select via the monitor's OSD with full brightness control, which is very much appreciated. However, in my case, I actually preferred using the monitor in an SDR image because the image just looked a little bit better and the colors popped a little bit better. Now, on the subject of utilizing HDR or not, this brings me on to console gaming. And here, the monitor should be able to run 1440p at both 60Hz and 120Hz using the HDMI ports. You could, for some given reason, if you want to, run it at 1080p as well. Now, using the OSRD tool to see how fast the monitor responds, I was able to put it through its paces. And using the faster mode overdrive setting, which is the one I would actually recommend using, you'll be able to see the average initial time clocks in at 5.11 milliseconds and the presenting window sits at 83%. This does actually become even better on the fastest mode overdrive setting with an average initial time of 2.62 milliseconds and a percent in window at a perfect 100%. However, yet again, very much like the higher refresh rate of 180 Hz while using it with a PC, you can see the RGB overshoot becomes a lot more problematic. Now at 60 Hz and the faster mode preset, which again is recommended, you'll be able to see the average initial time sits at just 3.94 milliseconds with the percent in window sitting at a perfect 100%, while on the fastest mode preset, this drops down to 2.3 milliseconds and the percent in window sits at 100%, but the RGB overshoot again has a lot more error. To put it into context, you'll be able to see the UFO ghosting test, and very much like at 180 Hz, both at 120 Hz and 60 Hz, there's a lot more RGB overshoot towards the lighter shades on the fastest mode preset. Yet again, re-emphasizing the point that if you were to get this monitor, I would suggest running it on the faster mode preset. Now here, it's also worth mentioning that at 120 Hz with adaptive sync technologies disabled, you should be able to run MBR. And that means motion blur reduction technologies will be able at 120 Hz, and you can still customize the overdrive setting, which is very much appreciated. This will effectively give you a clearer image and therefore might be something that you might want to look to enable if you're running it at that higher refresh rate. Now, with the gaming section out of the way, what about when it comes to image quality? Well, as a reminder, you've got both the 27-inch and 32-inch form factors to choose from, and they operate at the same resolution and refresh rate of 1440p and 180 Hz respectively. Now, the 32-inch form factor will give you lower pixel density, in other words PPI for short, but in my case, while reading text, it doesn't really affect me in the slightest. That larger form factor might be appreciated by certain people who are using it both for text usage or indeed gaming, but that is quite subjective. And in fact, if you want to see a detailed breakdown of the different pixel densities and how that might affect your readability, then make sure you check out my detailed video, which can be found up on your pop-up banner by following the links down in the description below. Now, apart from that, I would like to mention that through the monitor's OSD, you have got a dedicated RGB setting and also an sRGB mode, which you can toggle on. It's also fantastic to see that you've got full brightness controls. Now, using the sRGB mode to test the overall color accuracy, you'll be able to see here that the gamut coverage clocked in at 97.6% and a gamut volume at 107.3%. Below you can see how it compares to the standards. As for the average delta, it's sat at 1.51 and a maximum of 3.33, so therefore it can be used for light image editing work or video grading. Its Tesla's contrast ratio clocked in at a whopping 4016:1, while the measured white point was actually pretty bang on to the 6504 Kelvin target at 6436 Kelvin at 100%. The same could be said about its gamma curve, which sits very close to the 2.2 standards. Now, if you're not going to be doing any sort of image editing work or video grading, you might want to unlock the wider color gamut of this monitor. In other words, for example, if you're just going to be gaming with the monitor, use one of the other settings, or indeed just disable the sRGB mode, because it'll give you a little bit of extra pop on your image. Now, moving on from color performance, let's talk about brightness. And here in HDR, with the user mode selected at 100% brightness, I clocked in a peak of 331 nits, while in the other modes, it went down to 292 nits. It is actually quite fascinating because in SDR I actually recorded a higher brightness of 387 nits. It is quite a rarity because normally it's the other way around. Nonetheless, over here it means that the monitor does actually get pretty bright and you'll have no issues whatsoever running it in a bright sunlit room. In my case, I ran it at roughly 40 to 50% brightness. Now, as for the MBR levels, you've got 20 to choose from, and at the maximum one, it got all the way down to 128 nits. So therefore, it's actually still pretty usable, even if you're using MBR. Do bear in mind the comments I mentioned before about MBR being utilized and where it can be utilized. Now, in terms of the overall minimum brightness, it gets down to 93 nits. And therefore might be something to consider if you're going to be using this monitor in a very dark room, because the overall minimum brightness of the monitor isn't actually that dim. Now, on that note, and for me to test the overall backlight bleed, I shoved the monitor brightness to 100% and turn off all the lights. Here you'll be able to see the monitor's backlight bleed, which is actually pretty acceptable, at least in my opinion. Indeed, this is a VA panel, so therefore will perform better than its IPS counterparts, but it's still worth bearing in mind over here that you'll be able to see some clouding towards the edges, just to how the backlight is actually operating on this monitor. Elsewhere, in terms of the overall brightness uniformity, on my tested panel, which I appreciate is somewhat panel lottery, it actually did well across the board. Next up, let's talk about its overall build quality. And here you've got a three-side borderless design with a relatively thin bottom bezel. You've also got a 1500R curvature, so therefore it should fit in most sort of desktop scenarios. Now, as for the stand, it's made in part of recycled material, which is certainly appreciated, and has a white finish to it. Here it provides you height, tilt, and swivel adjustments. However, it does not provide you pivots. In other words, you cannot rotate it, and therefore means that if that's something that you're looking forward to, then you can replace the built-in stand with a VESA compatible stand, and yes, an adapter is provided within the box, allowing you to place it on a monitor arm or a multi-monitor setup. Now, at the back of the monitor, you might have noticed some RGB lights, and normally I'm not really fond of them, but in this instance, they're using Philips's Ambiglow technology and also utilizing artificial intelligence to better the experience. Now, here it's actually really interesting to see Philips's Ambiglow technology filtering down to a more affordable product, because normally this is reserved for more of the flagship products out there. And yes, in comparison to the vast majority of its competitors, nothing like this really exists. Now, Philips's Ambiglow technology is a great way of extending what you see on the screen and projecting it on a nearby wall. Sure, it might not be as bright as, for example, a Philips television, but for example, if you have a darker environment, then, for example, the follow video mode does add to an extra degree of immersion, which I do think a lot of people will actually appreciate. You can also have regular RGB light if you so wish instead, and therefore utilize the RGB configuration at the back of the monitor. That also explains why you've got a white finish, because it allows it to really shine a little bit better. Now, for you to tinker around with the Ambiglow settings, you'll want to navigate on the monitor's OSD, which can be accessed via a small little joystick button that's found at the back right-hand side. Here, the monitor's OSD does take a little bit of getting used to in terms of the navigation, but once you get your head around it, you'll find a plethora of options and allow you to tinker around with every single setting that you require. Furthermore, for those with a keen eye, you might have noticed an audio setting. And here it's worth pointing out that the monitor does not have any built-in speakers. However, this is utilized because you can output audio via the 3.5mm jack, therefore routing audio directly via the monitor and then plugging in a set of headphones into the monitor. So there we have it. Hopefully you've enjoyed my detailed video on this monitor. I'll be curious to know what you make of it down in the comment section below, and if you had to pick between 27-inch and 32-inch at 1440p, which would it be? And if you have enjoyed this video, definitely do consider dropping a like, subscribing and hitting that bell notification, all of which would be greatly appreciated. As such, I've been Totally Dubbed, and I hopefully see you in the next one. Take care of yourselves, and goodbye.